Hey there. This is me again. I've got one. This is sort of an add on kind of a presentation. And so I want you to see some additional photographers that didn't really come about um, in the original lecture here. So I'm going to go through these kind of quick. So this should be a fairly quick uh, rundown of a few photographers that I think you ought to take a look at, and you should be able to identify these on the exam as well, at least some of them. So I just wanted to give you a little taste of some of the people that have been important in photography since, well, most of these are in 20th century photographers for the most part. Starting with Walker Evans. Walker Evans was he was another photographer who, like Dorothea Lange, was a, a Depression era photographer, and he photographed a lot of the poor people who were, struck with the um, dust bowl drought. And this is a lady by the name of Allie Mae Burroughs. But he was also hired by the Farm Administration. Farm. Always want to say Farm Services Administration. You don't need to remember that, but it was a part of the federal government that was hiring photographers like him and Lang and maybe some others as well to photograph and document the issues surrounding Great Depression. So. Evans was also kind of a documentary photographer for in New York City. This is early in the 20th century, as you can see from the car. Horses were still a pretty uh, major means of transportation and of moving goods and people, even into the fairly well into the 20th century, even into the 30s and 40s almost. So you did see them still even in big cities. So there you go. Some street kids in New York, in a sort of a tough neighborhood. He also the next photographer here is a guy by the name of Gordon Parks. We saw a portrait of him earlier. Gordon Parks he was sort of a Renaissance man, and he did filmmaking, and he was also a composer. And did a number of different things in his life. He did this. One of the things he did was this photo documentary project on Ella Watson, who was a woman um, who was a cleaning person in one of the buildings in New York, in Washington D.C. And of course, here you've got her. This is more like commentary than photo documentary, but she looks so much like. Kind of a blending of the two characters in the famous painting American Gothic. The farmer and his wife standing in front of their home, that was done by an artist by the name of Grant Wood. So this is kind of his commentary about maybe this is sort of the other America, the non-Grant Wood America. I don't know. Not that Grant Wood was focused on wealthy people all the time, but that the farmer and his wife were just one aspect, and he sort of came up with this, and so he did this documentary about this woman. This is, I believe, her daughter, and this, view from her window. I mean, this is Washington D.C. In the 50s, really. She was a religious person. So this is sort of telling a story about this lady. Here's some of her religious activity. So Parks was a documentary photographer. Another one of my favorite photographers is this lady by the name of Margaret Burke White, and I think we saw one of her photos earlier, which was the liberation. This is her actually, and it was a photo she took of the liberation of people in Birkenau, I believe, which was one of the concentration camps that the Nazis had. This is another photo of her. This is on top of the Chrysler building. And I tell you what, the wind up there must be something ferocious. It's very, somewhat risky to climb up there on top of that. This would have to have been in the 30s, probably, maybe later. She was a Life magazine photographer, one of the first. And as I think I've mentioned before, Life magazine was really was a major publication in its day. In terms of being, and it was the first really strong presenter of good photojournalism. This is Gandhi. I don't know the full story on this, but this is a portrait, and I believe this may have been shortly before his death, like within a day or two, if not hours. Gandhi was assassinated. But he was also, this is his spinning wheel. And of course, he had this very minimalist lifestyle in his, which was part of his whole aesthetic, I guess. We've seen this photograph before, I think. This is a victims of a flood, showing the kind of the two Americas there, or at least a conception of what the two Americas were like. This is the liberation of one of the camps. What we're seeing here is that it was General Eisenhower, I believe, that sent American troops into the nearby towns and forced the residents to come up and walk through the camp and see just what it was that Hitler had been doing. Because many people said, "Oh, we had no idea," blah blah blah, and they knew Jews were disappearing, but no one wanted to really admit what was really happening. Which and maybe a lot of them didn't know exactly, but this is one of the more horrifying images, and of course these people are having a very difficult time with it. There's the liberation photo. Kind of the first look at some of the poor residents of this camp at the very end. Great portrait of an Inuit child. Wonderful, wonderful composition. I love it, and it's also got it's just got that kind of that nice framing around the face. Henri Cartier-Bresson is probably my favorite photographer. He's a lot of people's favorite photographer. He worked from the 30s into the 1980s sometime. He was initially a photojournalist. He founded one of the major photographic agencies. An agency was an organization that basically was contacted, and then they would contact photographers to do different assignments on behalf of a client. And but Cartier-Bresson had a concept which was called the decisive moment, which was that you waited until everything was exactly in balance, and the trick to a good photographer was finding that decisive moment when everything is in balance, when the elements are just right. And probably a lot of photographers, particular street photographers, do this. He's kind of the father of street photography, which was a genre that we've talked about. And you can tell if you look at this photo here. There's the bicyclist there in the middle of this picture, and he's got this wonderful framing, this kind of large element here. He's following kind of the golden ratio, or the rule of thirds, in terms of the composition. But the bicyclist had to be there. There's really no other way this photo would work. If the bicyclist was in here, he's covered up. If he waited too long, then you'd get the tail end of the cyclist, or the cyclist might be gone. So it's a perfect thing. Cartier-Bresson wasn't always too preoccupied with little niceties like having everything in focus either. And so a lot of his photos are not very well focused, but the compositions are wonderful. In this case, he's got a fairly slow shutter speed, which means that the bicyclist goes by and creates a blur, at least somewhat of a blur as he goes by. So there's a nice feeling of what? Apparent motion, right? There you go. This was sort of an accidental picture, but it's also one of his best known photos. It's behind a train station in Paris, and this is he managed to catch this gentleman when he just as he was about ready to hit the water, and there's this echo of his movement right here in the poster behind. The thing that makes this picture more remarkable is that he shot it through a fence, and he wasn't really able to, look through his viewfinder because of the way the fence was. That there was a hole in the fence, and he was not able to look through his viewfinder to see what exactly he was getting, and so he was sort of taking a chance, and this thing came about. Cartier-Bresson was one of the earliest well-known photographers to use the 35 millimeter film format, which is really still a standard. When we talk about full frame or full frame sensors on digital cameras, that means that full frame, that the sensor is the same size physically as the original 35 millimeter film frame, and that's a 2:3 aspect ratio, and that's what you're seeing here. This little boy, this another one. You have this sort of this curlicue kind of compositional guide that or compositional technique here that is used, and the boy, of course, is the dead center, but then you've got these leading lines. These are leading lines, or lines that sort of run down the center. A lot of times you see them in perspective that point to the main subject. You've got a line here, you've got lines, kind of a path that's created that comes down here. You've got lines here. The kid's in exactly the right spot. And Cartier-Bresson studied painting before he became a photographer. So he had studied a lot of what the best rules were of composition from his study of painting. And you've got these little girls, kind of impressed that here's this little boy. He's been sent out to pick up the wine for dinner, and he's very proud of himself. It's just a wonderful shot. This is a great shot, sort of showing a tangling of people this is in China, and this is there's a gold exchange open. People are trying to either buy or get gold. I'm not sure exactly the whole story on this, but there's a huge crush of people trying to get into a gold exchange. It's another photograph of Bresson's. This is three prostitutes working on each other's hair, and the composition. You've got the things in threes work real well in photographs a lot of the time, but you also have her pointing a little bit. They're all looking at the camera. They've got all these interesting kind of zigzag line of the arms going here and hers. So look at that. And that, I mean, it really has some wonderful aspects of it. And that's why it's good to spend time with photographs like this, to kind of just see what you can discover in them. The last one I want you to look at here, this is Diane Arbus. Some people pronounce it Deanne Arbus. Diane Arbus was a bit of a character. She was she specialized in taking photos of kind of freakish people in many cases. She was pretty fearless in terms of who she photographed and how she photographed them. She would actually go home with people. If she wanted someone to take their clothes off, sometimes she would too, just to make them comfortable so she could take their pictures. So she was a little weird, but she's actually considered one of the great photographers of the 20th century. A couple of her photos here. This is one of her more famous photos. This is it's a little boy with a hand grenade. And of course it's a toy, but it's just kind of there's some anger and frustration, and yet he's this little boy with the strap coming off of his short pants, and so it's kind of a fun picture, and yet it's also got sort of a creepy aspect of it that I kind of like as well. she did a lot of shooting of circus freaks, people in carnivals, that kind of stuff. And so you have this gentleman. Tattoos I guess are more common now, but even so, this guy's got a, a somewhat of a scary look. He's probably what they used to have, as someone you could view a tattooed people in carnivals and circus sideshows, things like that. This is one of her very well-known photos, and it's often cited as the kind of the inspiration for the framing of the two dead girls. They're the ghosts in The Shining. If you've ever seen the movie The Shining, this is the twins. These are two identical twins, and they have this, somewhat eerie look to them. And as a matter of fact, the story goes that their mother had just made these dresses for them for Easter or something like that, and they were very proud of their outfits. Of course, they were twins, so they were dressed alike, and so the picture is a little creepier than they are than they were. They never really and of course it was a quick moment. The kids probably didn't even remember it all that well in later life. Excuse me. Transvestite here, and that's what they called them at the time. This is not necessarily a trans woman, but it is a man who is dressed as a woman. It depends on, kind of depend. The sexuality is a little ambiguous here in terms of what exactly is going on. But she did focus on people who were somewhat outside the mainstream sexually as well. Anyway, that is the end of that thing there. So I will have another slideshow up for you, probably if not the same day you see this, the day after. I think I'm going to try to get this up Monday night, the 6th. And then on the 7th, there should be another lecture up about motion pictures. So look for that. I am trying to figure out exactly what it is we're going to do in terms of a final project, what I can have you do that doesn't violate some of the social distancing norms, and the projects that I usually have as the final project, none of them really gives you much leeway, so or that none of them really fits in that box. So I'm going to have to kind of think about it a little bit. But the next lecture up will be on motion pictures. Following that, we'll talk about television, and we're going to get pretty close to the end of the semester at that point. The final exam will be online. It'll be a quiz. At this point, it should be a quiz within Canvas. So look for it. Look for that, and I'll give you plenty of warning on that. So